Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. The day I turned 72, I learned something far more painful than growing old. I learned what it feels like to disappear while still being alive. I woke up that morning before sunrise the way I always did. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. For a moment I smiled. Birthdays had never been about gifts for me. All I wanted was a phone call, a visit, maybe a few hours with the people I had spent my entire life loving. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching the early light settle over my backyard. My husband, Thomas, had planted those maple trees nearly 30 years ago. He used to joke that they would outlive both of us. 3 years after losing him, I still found myself looking toward his empty chair at the breakfast table. Old habits have a way of staying with you. Around 9 o'clock I checked my phone. Nothing. No messages. No missed calls. I told myself everyone was probably busy. Michael had work. Vanessa always had a full schedule. The grandchildren were young and wrapped up in their own lives. By noon, I had convinced myself not to be disappointed. By 2 o'clock I started making excuses for them. By 4, the silence had become impossible to ignore. I sat at my dining room table with a small birthday cake from the local bakery. Just 6 inches across. Vanilla with buttercream frosting. The woman at the bakery had written "Happy Birthday, Eleanor" in careful blue letters. I lit the candles anyway. 72 years old. I stared at the flames dancing in front of me and realized nobody even knew I was sitting there alone. Nobody had asked what I was doing. Nobody had wondered if I had plans. Nobody had remembered. I blew out the candles and laughed softly to myself. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes disappointment becomes so familiar it almost feels routine. As evening settled over the neighborhood, I washed the dishes, wrapped the remaining cake and placed it in the refrigerator. Then I carried a cup of tea into the living room and opened Facebook. That was my mistake. The first photograph appeared before I even finished loading the page. There was Michael smiling beside Vanessa. Sophia and Ethan stood between them. Behind them was a long restaurant table crowded with relatives, cousins, in-laws, even distant family members I had not seen in years. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. I stared at the screen as more photos appeared. Laughter, birthday balloons, toasts, family group pictures. The caption read, "Wonderful family night together. Feeling blessed." My chest tightened. Not because they had gathered. Because they had gathered without me. Nobody had forgotten my birthday. They had remembered it perfectly. They had simply chosen to celebrate without inviting me. I sat in the glow of the screen for a long time. The tea grew cold in my hands. Outside, darkness settled over the yard Thomas once loved. Inside, a truth finally settled inside me as well. I had spent years believing I was being overlooked. That night, I understood something far worse. I wasn't forgotten. I had been erased. That night, I did not cry. I think that surprised me more than anything. I sat in my living room long after the photographs stopped appearing on my screen. The house was quiet. The same quiet that had filled every room since Thomas passed away 3 years earlier. First, I used to fight that silence. I kept the television on. I left the radio playing in the kitchen. I called friends more often than I normally would. But eventually I learned that loneliness has a sound of its own. You either learn to live with it or spend your life running from it. The next morning I woke up at 6:30 as usual. I made coffee. I watered the plants near the front window. I fed the birds that gathered outside every day. Nothing looked different. Yet something inside me had shifted. Once a painful truth becomes clear, it is impossible to unsee it. As I moved through the house, memories began surfacing one after another. Christmas 4 years ago. Michael called 2 days before the holiday. He explained that Vanessa's parents were hosting dinner and space would be limited. They promised to visit me the following weekend. They never did. Thanksgiving the year after that. I spent 2 days preparing food. A turkey, homemade stuffing, sweet potato casserole, became pie. Then a text message arrived less than 3 hours before dinner. Everyone suddenly had other plans. I remember placing the untouched leftovers into containers, and stacking them in the refrigerator. It took me nearly a week to finish eating them. Then there was Sophia's high school graduation. I learned about the ceremony from social media photographs posted afterward. When I asked Michael why nobody had told me, he sounded genuinely surprised. He said he thought Vanessa had invited me. Vanessa later claimed she thought Michael had done it. Somehow nobody was responsible. Somehow I was always the missing piece no one noticed. At least that was the story they told. Looking back, I realized the pattern had lasted for years. Small exclusions, tiny disappointments, forgotten invitations, last-minute cancellations. Each incident seemed harmless on its own. Together they formed something much larger. A picture I had refused to see. Around noon my phone finally rang. For a brief moment, I wondered if someone had remembered my birthday after all. The screen showed Michael's name. I answered immediately. He sounded cheerful, relaxed, completely unaware of what had happened the day before. He spent nearly 10 minutes talking about a problem with his car. The repair estimate was higher than expected. Money was tight. He asked for advice. Then he thanked me for listening and ended the call. Not once did he mention my birthday. Not once did he ask how I was doing. After the line went silent, I stared at the phone in my hand. For years, I had convinced myself that family relationships naturally changed over time. People became busy. Life moved fast. But that afternoon, sitting alone in the same chair Thomas used to occupy, I finally asked myself a question I should have asked long ago. If they never had time for me, why did they always seem to have time when they needed something from me? The question stayed with me for days. Carried it from room to room as I dusted shelves, folded laundry, and watered the flowers Thomas had once cared for himself. The answer was uncomfortable because it was so simple. They always found time when they needed something. Once I started paying attention, the memories arrived faster. 5 years earlier, Michael had called one Saturday morning sounding stressed. The transmission in his truck had failed, and the repair bill was more than he could handle. I wrote a check that afternoon. 2 years after that, Vanessa wanted to start a small online business. She spoke excitedly about inventory, marketing, and growth. I listened for nearly an hour while she explained her plans. Before the conversation ended, she asked whether I could help with the initial investment. I agreed. She thanked me warmly. A week later, I barely heard from her. Then there was Sophia's first year of college. Tuition costs were higher than expected. Michael assured me it was only temporary. I transferred money from my savings account without hesitation. I loved my grandchildren. Helping them never felt like a burden. What troubled me now was not the money. It was the pattern. Every major conversation seemed to begin with a need, a repair, a payment, a favor, a contribution. When they reached out, there was usually a destination in mind. The call itself was rarely the destination. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a cup of coffee. I began writing down the occasions I could remember. The list grew surprisingly long. New tires, medical bills, summer camp fees, home renovations, emergency expenses, graduation gifts, plane tickets. The numbers themselves did not bother me. What bothered me was the empty space between them. The birthdays missed. The invitations forgotten. The holidays canceled. The months that passed without anyone asking how I was doing. As I stared at the notebook, my eyes drifted toward a framed photograph on the counter. It had been taken nearly 15 years earlier. Thomas stood behind me with his hands on my shoulders. Michael was smiling. Vanessa was smiling too. The grandchildren were small enough to fit comfortably in our laps. We looked like the kind of family people envied. Looking at that picture, I found myself wondering when everything had changed. Or perhaps the harder question was whether it had changed at all. Maybe I had simply stopped noticing. A few days later, Michael called again. This time he sounded frustrated about rising expenses, interest rates, insurance costs, property taxes. I listened patiently while he spoke. Then he paused. There was a hesitation in his voice I recognized immediately. He was building toward a request. Before he could continue, I glanced down at the notebook still sitting on my table. For the first time in years, I did not feel guilty. I did not feel obligated. I simply listened. And as the silence stretched between us, I realized something important. The people who claimed to know me best had spent years treating my generosity like a permanent resource. They knew exactly what I could do for them. I was no longer sure they knew anything about me at all. The following Tuesday, I received a call from someone I had not spoken to in nearly a year. It was George Whitmore, the attorney who had handled several legal matters for Thomas and me over the decades. His voice sounded as steady as ever. He asked how I was doing and then suggested we meet for lunch. There was nothing unusual about the invitation, but something in his tone made me curious. We met at a small restaurant downtown that Thomas and I used to visit on anniversaries. The place had not changed much. The booths were the same dark wood. The coffee was still strong enough to wake the dead. George arrived carrying a leather folder that looked as old as our friendship. After a few minutes of conversation, he placed the folder on the table and folded his hands. He told me there were documents Thomas had specifically instructed him to review with me when the time felt appropriate. I felt my heart tighten at the mention of my husband. Even after 3 years, hearing his name could still stop me in my tracks. George carefully explained that Thomas had been more thorough than I ever realized. During the final years of his life, he had reorganized several investments, protected certain assets, and created long-term plans designed to ensure I would always be secure. As George spoke, I realized how little attention I had paid to those matters while Thomas was alive. He always handled the paperwork. I trusted him completely. George slid several pages across the table. I stared at numbers much larger than I expected to see. Accounts, investments, property interests, resources that had quietly grown over many years. Thomas had never been flashy. We lived comfortably but modestly. Looking at those documents, I understood that he had been planning for my future far more carefully than I knew. George watched my expression and smiled gently. Then he said something I would think about for weeks afterward. He said, "Eleanor, many people believe wealth changes families. In my experience, it usually reveals them." On the drive home, his words echoed in my mind. That evening, I sat alone in my living room reviewing the documents again. For the first time in years, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. I thought about every forgotten holiday, every canceled invitation, every conversation that ended with a request. Then I looked at the plans Thomas had left behind. My security had never depended on anyone else's kindness. I had simply forgotten that. The next afternoon, Michael called again. Before he could finish explaining another financial difficulty, I politely told him I could not help this time. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer. He sounded surprised, almost confused, as though he had encountered a version of me he had never met before. We ended the conversation quickly. After I hung up, I sat quietly by the window and watched the afternoon sun move across the backyard. For the first time in a very long while, saying no did not make me feel guilty. It made me feel awake. About a week after my lunch with George, something strange began happening. At first, it was small enough that I almost missed it. On Monday morning, I found a bouquet of flowers sitting on my front porch. There was no special occasion. No holiday. No birthday. The card simply said, "Thinking of you. Love, Vanessa." I stood there for a moment holding the arrangement. In nearly 20 years of knowing my daughter-in-law, I could count on one hand the number of times she had sent me flowers. I placed them in a vase anyway. 2 days later, Michael called just to talk. At least that was how the conversation began. He asked about my garden. He asked whether I had been sleeping well. He even asked if I needed help with anything around the house. The questions sounded pleasant, but they also sounded unfamiliar. After we hung up, I found myself staring at the phone with the same feeling a person gets when hearing a song they have not heard in decades. Familiar yet somehow strange. Then the invitations started arriving. Dinner on Friday night. A family barbecue the following weekend. A movie night with the grandchildren. An offer to spend Sunday afternoon together. For years, finding time for me had seemed nearly impossible. Suddenly everyone appeared to have extra hours available. The change was so dramatic that it would have been amusing if it had not been so revealing. One evening, I attended a family dinner at Michael's house. Vanessa greeted me at the door with a warm smile. Sophia hugged me. Ethan offered to carry my purse. The dining table was beautifully prepared. Throughout the meal, everyone seemed unusually attentive. They listened carefully when I spoke. They laughed at stories they would have ignored a month earlier. They asked questions about my hobbies, my plans, and my health. To anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like a perfect family gathering. Yet something felt rehearsed, like actors who had memorized their lines but forgotten the meaning behind them. During dessert, I noticed Vanessa exchange a quick glance with Michael. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have noticed it. But when you spend years sitting quietly at the edges of conversations, you learn to see small things. Later that night, after I returned home, I received a text message from a distant cousin. We exchanged pleasantries before she casually mentioned hearing that Thomas had left excellent provisions for my future. I read the message twice. Then I understood. News travels quickly through families, faster than most people realize. Somehow, information about my financial security had begun circulating. Nobody knew the details. Nobody knew the numbers. But they knew enough. The flowers suddenly made sense. The invitations made sense. The phone calls made sense. I sat alone in my living room and looked around the house Thomas and I had built together. Nothing about me had changed. My character had not changed. My heart had not changed. My loneliness had not changed. The only thing that had changed was what people believed I possessed. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether they were coming to see me at all, or whether they were coming to see something else. Over the next few weeks, I decided not to confront anyone. Instead, I watched. There is a great deal you can learn when you stop explaining yourself and start paying attention. The invitations continued arriving with remarkable consistency. Every few days, someone called. Every weekend, there seemed to be another family gathering. One Saturday afternoon, Michael insisted on helping me clean out the garage. He had never shown much interest in the garage before. For years, the boxes had sat untouched. Now he appeared eager to organize everything. As we worked, he casually asked questions about the property. Had I considered downsizing? Was maintaining the house becoming difficult? Had I spoken to any financial advisors recently? The questions sounded innocent enough. Yet they all seemed to point in the same direction. Later that week, Vanessa invited me to lunch. She chose an upscale restaurant overlooking the river. Throughout the meal, she was unusually attentive. She complimented my appearance. She asked about my hobbies. She even apologized for being so busy over the years. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me wanted to accept that perhaps people could change. But then the conversation slowly drifted toward future planning. Retirement communities, estate planning, long-term financial decisions. The shift was subtle, smooth enough that most people would not have noticed. I noticed. The following Sunday, Sophia and Ethan stopped by unexpectedly. I genuinely enjoyed seeing them. Unlike the adults, the grandchildren still carried a certain honesty. We baked cookies together and spent the afternoon talking. Before leaving, Sophia mentioned that her parents had been discussing how important family unity was becoming. The comment seemed harmless until she added that they talked about it almost every day lately. After the front door closed behind them, I sat quietly in the kitchen. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Not perfectly, but clearly enough. Around that time, George called to check on me. During our conversation, I shared some of the recent changes. He listened patiently before offering a piece of advice. He told me that people often reveal their priorities when they believe an opportunity is within reach. The closer they think they are to something valuable, the harder it becomes for them to hide their intentions. His words stayed with me. Over the next several days, I paid closer attention than ever before. I noticed how conversations frequently returned to the future. I noticed how often people asked about my plans. I noticed how carefully certain subjects were avoided. Nobody directly mentioned money. Nobody directly mentioned inheritance. Yet the topic seemed present in every room, hovering just beneath the surface. One evening, as I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange, I reached a decision. If everyone was suddenly so interested in my future, perhaps it was time to learn exactly why. Not through arguments, not through accusations, through observation, through patience, through a simple test. And as I watched the last light disappear beyond the trees Thomas had planted decades earlier, I realized that for the first time in years, I was no longer reacting to the story. I was beginning to control it. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, the entire family gathered for a Sunday dinner at Michael's house. The atmosphere felt warm, almost unusually so. Vanessa had prepared my favorite dessert. Michael kept refilling my glass of iced tea. Even Ethan volunteered to help me with my chair before dinner. Throughout the evening, everyone seemed determined to make me feel important. I smiled. I thanked them. I played my part perfectly. Halfway through dessert, I decided it was time. I set down my fork and mentioned that I had recently spent some time with George Whitmore. The reaction was immediate, although subtle. Michael looked up first. Vanessa stopped moving for a fraction of a second. Sophia and Ethan continued eating, unaware of anything unusual. I casually explained that George and I had been reviewing some paperwork and discussing future plans. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody changed the subject. In fact, the room became noticeably quieter. Then I added a single sentence. I said that I was considering updating my will. The silence that followed was impossible to miss. It lasted only a moment before everyone began speaking again, but something had changed. Questions appeared almost instantly. Was everything all right? Was I making major decisions? Did I need help organizing documents? Had George recommended any changes? I answered politely while revealing almost nothing. I simply explained that life changes and sometimes paperwork should change too. That was all. By the time I returned home that evening, my phone already contained 3 new messages. One was from Michael checking on me. Another was from Vanessa asking whether I wanted to have lunch later in the week. The third was from a relative I had not heard from in nearly 8 months. Over the next several days, the attention increased dramatically. Invitations arrived almost daily. Phone calls became more frequent. Even small conversations seemed carefully designed to emphasize family togetherness. Yet the most revealing part was not what people said. It was how differently they behaved from one another. Michael focused on responsibility. He reminded me of everything he had done over the years. Vanessa focused on affection. She spoke constantly about family bonds and emotional connections. Distant relatives suddenly shared old memories and offered assistance with tasks I had never asked them to perform. Everyone seemed eager to strengthen their relationship with me. The timing was impossible to ignore. One afternoon I sat with George in his office and described everything I had observed. He listened quietly before leaning back in his chair. Then he asked a simple question. Eleanor, before you mentioned updating your will, how often were these people calling? I laughed softly because we both knew the answer. Not often. George nodded. He did not need to say anything else. The evidence was speaking for itself. As the days passed, I continued watching. The more attention I received, the clearer everything became. People were revealing themselves without realizing it. Every phone call, every invitation, every carefully chosen word. By the end of the month, I understood something that had escaped me for years. I finally knew who truly cared about me, and I finally knew who cared about something else. Once the picture became clear, making the decision was not nearly as difficult as I had imagined. The difficult part had been accepting the truth. For years, I had held on to the version of my family that existed in my memories rather than the one standing in front of me. I remembered school plays, family vacations, birthday parties, and holiday dinners crowded around a table. I remembered the sacrifices Thomas and I made to give Michael every opportunity we could afford. I remembered believing that love, when given freely enough, would eventually come back to you. But life does not always work that way. Some people appreciate what you give. Others simply become accustomed to receiving it. One afternoon I took a long drive through town. I passed the church where Thomas and I were married. I passed the park where Michael learned to ride a bicycle. I passed the little diner where our family celebrated countless birthdays over the years. Every place carried a memory. Every memory carried a lesson. By the time I returned home, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The following week I met with George again. We spent several hours reviewing documents, discussing options, and updating plans. George never pressured me toward any particular choice. He simply asked thoughtful questions. Who had truly been present in my life? Who showed kindness when there was nothing to gain? Who treated me as a person rather than a possibility? Those questions mattered far more than any dollar amount written on a piece of paper. As I considered the answers, certain faces came to mind. Neighbors who checked on me after storms. Friends who invited me to dinner when they knew I felt lonely. Volunteers at the community center who always greeted me by name. Even Sophia and Ethan occupied a different place in my heart than the adults. Their affection had never felt calculated. Their kindness had never arrived attached to expectations. The process took several weeks, but when it was finished, I felt surprisingly peaceful. For the first time in years, my future reflected my values instead of other people's assumptions. Meanwhile, the attention from family continued. More lunches. More invitations. More phone calls. I remained polite. I remained gracious. I never argued. I never accused anyone of anything. There was no reason to. Their actions had already provided every answer I needed. One evening, Michael called to tell me how important family was. He spoke passionately about staying connected and supporting one another. I listened quietly, then thanked him for sharing his thoughts. After we hung up, I sat on my back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. A cool breeze moved through the yard. The same yard Thomas had loved. The same yard where I had spent years wondering why I no longer seemed to matter. Now I understood something important. My value had never depended on whether others recognized it. It had always been there. I had simply forgotten. And as I looked toward the future, I knew one final step remained. Very soon, everyone would learn that decisions made in silence can carry more weight than promises made out loud. 3 months later, everyone gathered in George Whitmore's office. The meeting had been scheduled well in advance, and by the time that morning arrived, I could almost feel the anticipation hanging in the air. Michael sat beside Vanessa. Several relatives occupied the remaining chairs. Everyone was polite. Everyone was smiling. Yet beneath the surface, there was an energy I had come to recognize. Hope, expectation, assumption. George greeted each person warmly. Before taking his seat at the head of the conference table, sunlight streamed through the large windows behind him. Outside, the city moved through an ordinary day. Inside, everyone seemed focused on a single question. George began by reviewing routine matters. He explained legal procedures. He answered questions. He moved carefully through the paperwork. The longer he spoke, the quieter the room became. Eventually, he opened the final folder resting in front of him. I noticed Vanessa straighten slightly in her chair. Michael folded his hands together. Several relatives exchanged brief glances. George adjusted his glasses and began reading. As the details unfolded, I watched faces rather than documents. That was far more interesting. First, people appeared confident. Then came confusion. Then surprise. Then silence. The assumptions they had carried into that room were slowly dissolving. George explained that I had chosen to distribute my estate according to my personal values and experiences. He described several charitable gifts supporting programs that assisted seniors living alone. He outlined contributions designated for community organizations that had brought genuine companionship into my life after Thomas passed away. He spoke about educational funds established for Sophia and Ethan because their kindness had never felt conditional. Throughout the reading, nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The room simply grew quieter with each passing minute. When George finished, the silence lingered. Michael looked stunned. Vanessa stared down at the table. Other relatives seemed unsure what to say. The outcome clearly differed from what many had expected. Yet as I sat there listening to the silence, I felt no anger. No satisfaction. No desire for revenge. What I felt was peace. For years I had mistaken attention for love. I had confused obligation with connection. I had believed that giving more would eventually inspire people to care more. The truth was simpler than that. Genuine relationships do not appear when opportunity appears. Genuine relationships exist long before opportunity arrives. Eventually, Michael cleared his throat and asked a few polite questions. George answered them professionally. The meeting concluded shortly afterward. One by one, people gathered their belongings and left the room. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered brief goodbyes. I wished each of them well. When the office finally emptied, George and I stood near the window overlooking the street below. He asked whether I was comfortable with my decision. I smiled and told him I had never been more certain. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, A gentle breeze moved through the trees lining the sidewalk. For the first time in many years, I felt completely free. The people who had overlooked me when I needed companionship had spent months chasing an opportunity that no longer existed. Meanwhile, I walked away with something far more valuable than any inheritance. I walked away knowing exactly who I was, exactly what I deserved, and exactly why some things can never be measured by money. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.